There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today. I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 291. And joining me today is accomplished public land deer hunter Joe Elsinger to break down how he patterns locations instead of bucks and the tools he uses to analyze deer movements in correlation with weather-related factors. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by OnX. And today, as I just mentioned, we've got Joe Elsinger, also commonly known as the Professor, and we call him that because he is a thinker. He's an analyzer. He's a detail-oriented problem solver, I think would be a good way to put it, when it comes to chasing mature bucks. And he's doing this on public land in the big woods of Wisconsin and up in Iowa. He's been on the show a couple times before. He's proven to be a fan favorite guest, just a really good educator. I think something about the way he communicates makes it easy to take in, but powerful stuff. So episode number 150 in particular is a must listen if you haven't already checked that one out, as it covers Joe's kind of total all-around hunting strategy. But today we're focusing on one particular topic, which is patterning deer. Or I guess at least that's what I thought we were going to talk about when I started this conversation with him, because I thought, okay, let's dive deep into patterning deer. But what I quickly discovered was that's not really what Joe is focusing on. Rather, he's all about patterning specific locations. And then he's using a really detailed kind of process of collecting and analyzing data to help him do that, to help him understand when to hunt certain spots throughout the year and different prime places to be all throughout the year. So it's not just about when to kill this buck, when's the best day to go in after him. It's what's the best place to be no matter what time of year it is. And man, it's just a really interesting way of thinking about this. And it's different than what most other people talk about, and really the way I talk about this stuff too. So this is kind of a new idea for me that I'm definitely going to be taking to heart this year. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're also going to be discussing the tools he's created to analyze all sorts of data like this. He's got a really interesting set of analyses he runs on trail camera data. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the lessons he's learned and the trends he's uncovered when he's studying all these different types of deer sightings and photos and then comparing them to changes in things like temperature and pressure and the moon and much more. So, man, I'll tell you what, if you enjoy geeking out over deer, today's episode is for you. That said, before we get to it, we are going to take a really quick break, and then we will get to our chat with Joe. All right, so with me now, back on the show for, I think, the third time, maybe, is Joe Elsinger. We like to call you the Professor. Joe, thanks for coming back.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Since the professor name was applied to you on the podcast a couple of years ago, do you have anyone yet that makes jokes about like tweed vests and pipes and glasses or anything like that for you?
I think I've gotten a couple of those comments, yeah, and that's definitely not me. Anyone who's hung out with me, that's definitely not me. So, yeah, maybe in another 20 years.
That's good. Glad no one's giving you a hard time.
Thank Andy May for that one, I think.
Yo. Well, I'm glad you are back with us because each time I've gotten a chat with you, it's just been super interesting for me. And we've always gotten great feedback. People have found your insights really helpful. And today I'm sure we're gonna get the same kind of thing. But I'm excited, and I kind of want to just jump right into it, Joe. Hope you don't mind me avoiding the foreplay and just going right to the main event, because
go for it.
We got a cool topic today of patterning deer and correlating deer activity to other outside factors. And this idea came about because, I don't know, a month or two ago, me and Dan were doing a podcast, just the two of us, and we were talking about how both of us really are looking at annual patterns and looking through trail camera data and stuff. And I happened to bring up the fact that I had made kind of a pretty rudimentary spreadsheet in which I was tracking all the daylight pictures and daylight observations I had of a certain buck, and then a certain number of other variables, weather-related things. So I was talking about that to Dan, and then a bunch of people asked me to share that spreadsheet. So I shared a picture of it on Instagram, and I think maybe that's what you saw, because then you reached out to me and said, hey, I do the same thing. You might remember we talked about it a little bit a couple of years ago, but you shared with me this document, and you just take things to a whole new level as far as tracking deer movement and all the different correlating variables. And just the document itself kind of blew my mind. The level of analysis you put in here, trying to understand what different things impact deer movement, how you're tracking these things. The level of detail and analysis is just, it's fascinating. And I think it would really help people, because a lot of folks know to pay attention, like, oh yeah, I think, cold fronts will make deer move more, or I think such and such thing. And there's lots of different theories. Not a lot of people I know actually go about tracking it in a way that can be quantified. But I guess if you go by what's the word? Not nickname. There's a fancier word for nickname I'm blanking on right now. But if people call you the professor, you should probably quantify your work. And you do that.
Yeah. I'm an engineer by trade, so that's my disclaimer, is I'm a numbers guy. I'm a nerd. I'm happy to admit that I'm a nerd. So it's definitely not for everybody. But yeah, thanks. You are spot on how that why I passed it on to you. So as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I'm a little behind on your podcast, which I love. I've, listened to every single one, but I'm a couple months behind. And here a few weeks ago, I finally got to that podcast where you were talking about tracking that spreadsheet with, how you've been tracking observations with Dan. And yeah, that's exactly, I was like, you know what? I think I need to send that to Mark. So
I'm glad you did.
Here we are.
Yeah, it's spurred this bigger conversation. So what I want to do here, Joe, is talk in detail about kind of, we spoke briefly about patterning deer a couple of years ago, but now I want to go really deep into everything you're thinking about when it comes to understanding deer movement, maybe understanding specific deer, and all of these things you're tracking and monitoring and trying to make decisions based off of. So to kick it off, I think I first want to lay some groundwork, get some definitions, some foundations out here. So when I say something like pattern a deer, when you think about patterning a deer, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It used to mean probably what the first thing that pops into the head of everybody else. I used to look at individual deer, and I still do, don't get me wrong. But now I've kind of, that's actually very hard. Everybody knows it's very, very hard to pattern individual deer. Bucks have individual personalities. Some are easier to pattern. They may have a very small core area, not necessarily easy to kill. And other ones have huge core areas, and they seem to drift around in many, many different bedding areas across thousands of acres and everything in between. So patterning an individual deer, yeah, I've done it. I've killed a few deer that I can say I went to a spot to kill them and I've killed them, but you're going to fail more often than you succeed. So now I really look at locations and I try to identify the optimal times for locations. And so I'm really patterning locations. And I found that's actually more helpful to me than when I was just going around and trying to figure out, okay, this deer's here and he's going to be over there tomorrow. And then, over there, 2 days from now, trying to figure that out. Now I look at individual locations and I keep track of the bucks in the area, but I can, particularly bedding areas, because I hunt, the refresher from some of the things that I've said at previous podcasts. I hunt vast majority public land. And even the private land I hunt is generally shared with, and I don't hunt. I used to hunt more private land. Now I'm very little, but no exclusive access property. So all the deer are getting pressured. So it's really, you have to dial into the bedding, to have success, especially with mature bucks. And that's what I do. So I'm trying to figure out when certain bedding areas are used. And I've learned a lot about that over the last few years, primarily by using observations while hunting, but primarily setting trail cameras in bedding or in travel routes right next to bedding all fall. I used to think hanging a trail camera for 4 weeks straight and not touching it was a long time. Now I think that's actually short. That kind of shows how I've evolved in my thought process. And now I'll put them out in July, August, September. I've got a few cameras out already. I need to get a few more out in the next month or two, and they're going to stay there until the winter. Some of them I won't pick up till next spring. And I get these long, big chunks of data. And so I can sift through it and I look at wind, temperature, barometric pressure, and all these factors. And I've learned that bedding areas, there's really strong correlations between some of these things and when certain bedding areas are being used, and they're being used by certain bucks, certainly, because I'm targeting buck bedding, mature buck bedding. But that really has helped my efficiency in targeting these spots. So, I may have 3 or 4 months worth of data off of one camera, and there's strong correlations, and hey, this bedding area is used with, strong west winds, not light winds, colder than average temperatures, things like that. Certain times of the year, maybe it's mostly during the rut or maybe it's mostly in the early season. I found bedding that's primarily used in hot weather, primarily used in, cool weather, windy weather, calm weather, stable weather, bad, unpleasant, rainy weather. It's just really kind of eye-opening to me.
And then you're able to just be that much more efficient with your hunts then, because at any given time of the year, the optimal time to be in any given area.
Yeah, that's the goal. And it's never, don't get me wrong, I'm still far from perfection, but I've come a long ways. Now I think, give me 6-8 clean hunts at times that I can pick, and, I can get an opportunity or two in just that many hunts on public land. Granted, this is Iowa. We have a very good population of mature bucks, but still, it's public land. And I would point out, I'm doing more and more of this research up in northern Wisconsin too, on public land up there. So it's a completely different environment, but it helps me kind of confirm a lot of these things, that it's not just an Iowa thing, that I'm able to do this. I'm finding very strong trends in Wisconsin as well, in big woods habitat, swamps and tamarack swamps, and, around clear cuts and oak flats and that kind of thing. So, it's very interesting to me anyway. So,
me too.
And I love that side of things. It's not for everybody. I know I've talked to people about it, and some, it sucks all the fun out of it. This is intended to take the fun out of it. If it's not fun to think about this, then okay, just go hunting.
Yeah.
But if you do like to really try to stack the deck in your favor and play the odds, that's what I love. So
it's funny. Speaking of Iowa, I got to call out Dan, who's not with us here today, but and he's not here to defend himself. So sorry in advance, Dan. I'm going to call you out. But last time or 2 times ago that you were on the show, Joe, you were talking about this idea of how you run your cameras, and then at the end of the episode, you gave both Dan and I a piece of advice. And your piece of advice for Dan was don't check your camera so often. You go in there so often, check them. And he said, he's like, okay, I'll take your advice. And then I can confirm that he has not been taking your advice. He keeps talking about going there and checking them.
I've been listening. So yeah, if I remember right, last year he left one camera out like all fall. He forgot to check it, or maybe he forgot where it was or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then he was super excited about that, like what he learned off that. And I was like, oh my God, yeah. Well, maybe he realizes it now. I don't know. Yeah. It's so, and that's the thing. Like, yes, there are some, most of, I'm not targeting food sources. I'm targeting bedding. You can hang cameras on the edge of the food sources, and it's a lot lower impact to check them in many circumstances. I'm still leery of regular checking anything near where I'm hunting. But, and now of course you have wireless cameras, and that's a whole nother, gives a whole nother, people that want to use them, that really opens up a lot of options, for monitoring. But still, if you're intruding on bedding, mature bucks will notice it. They will, move accordingly. They may still be in the area. They might only move across the ridge, but they will know you're there, and they will, make sure that they're not, they don't have much risk from you. So, it's, you can hang cameras and check them frequently near food sources. Sometimes that's certainly true, but where I'm putting them, I couldn't go in and check. I would blow I'd blow deer out of, sometimes they're where I want to hunt, and I go in there and do a hunt, and that's it. But I've seen when in circumstances like that, I've seen the impact where, I'll get, say, 3 or 4 mature buck sightings in daylight over the course of a week, and then I'll have been in there, or more often, because it's public land, I'll see a hunter on camera, whether it's a squirrel hunter or another bow hunter or whatever coming through, and it'll be several days. There'll be just very minimal activity, and then I'll pick up again. So I see that all the time. Even during the rut. I mean, a lot of people, bucks are everywhere in the rut. Yeah, they definitely move a lot more, but they're still very intentional about where they move. That you can disturb an area, and there'll be a decrease in what you'll see in front of there in these high impact areas. It's one thing if you're just walking along a field edge, but it's another thing if you're walking in a bedding area 400 yards from a field, or like in northern Wisconsin, it's huge up there. I'll hunt on a swamp island where I'll have a camera, and then like for a week I won't get a deer. So it's interesting.
So in this kind of situation, if you're trying to pattern a location, before we get into all the variables you're looking at and all the data and stuff, let's first just let's check the box on how you get the data, which is pictures, right? Can you just walk me through a little bit more detail of when you're trying to pattern a location, what you're thinking about as far as where you're going to put a camera, how many cameras do you put out? Do you have any kind of system in place? Like if you wanted to learn this bedding area, do you put several cameras around it? Or what's your thought process once you're starting?
So, now I have a lot of cameras. By my standards, I used to think 10 cameras is a lot. Now I probably have like 15. I just bought a couple a year and for a number of years now, and now I've built up a larger quantity. But still, it's not many. And I know some people just carpet an area with cameras. I've never done that. Partly because I don't have that many cameras. Occasionally I'll drop in a couple pretty close together if I really can't figure out an area. But you do have to have a baseline knowledge of how mature bucks move across. the land. And I know I've talked about this before. Like, you've got to achieve that. Cameras don't even necessarily tell you all that. You've got to kind of learn that the hard way by a lot of hunting and a lot of time invested in observing them. And then I can go in and I can pick out, if I think a buck's bedding in an area, I can pick out 2 or 3 most likely travel routes in and out of that. And then sometimes it's 1 or 2 that seem to be clearly favored. And it's really interesting. I've gotten to the point of, and anybody else can too, you can predict, like, oh, they'll come in this way, to bed in the morning, and they'll leave that way in the evening. In the morning, J-hook, they usually do J-hook. And in the evening, they usually get up and just leave straight, going to food or does or wherever their destination is. So it's often 2 different directions. They don't come and go. And I see that on camera too. When I'm setting a camera like on an access route into bedding, I know, okay, well, I don't always know ahead of time. Sometimes they surprise me, but usually I get mostly morning activity or evening activity, even though the deer are there all day. They don't come and go on that camera. They heavily favor either morning or evening. And if my camera's in the bedding, I'll get a lot of midday movement. Mm-hmm. Bucks are up and moving midday more than you'd believe. They don't move very far, usually, especially on public land and stuff, but they do get up. They have to get up biologically. They have to stand up. They cannot lay on the ground for 12 hours straight, from what I understand, or they'll die. So they have to get up, browse, relieve themselves, and bed back down. So I'll get them doing that all the time. If my camera is literally right, say watching a cluster of beds or right in between a couple of beds. So another reason deer get up and move, and this is another big indicator I've keyed in on, is temperature. As the temperature changes over the course of the day, deer will move. Say it's hot weather, they will move to the coolest spot. It's kind of temperature-based bedding, and that's there's actually some really strong trends there. They will seek cool when it's hot, and they will seek warmer areas when it's cold. And getting out of the elements, they'll seek the thermal cover. And that'll change over the day. They may be. I've put cameras over individual beds, and I'll get deer consistently. Like, they'll bed there up until 10 a.m. and then they'll get up and leave because it gets too sunlit and warm in the summer months, and they'll be moving to a more shaded, cooler area. So, that's and all those little, there's no one thing that, you can use this and all of a sudden you can kill big bucks. There's all these little layers you can put together, and it's fascinating. I'm definitely not an expert on it, but I've started to kind of grasp the overall picture. They still surprise me a lot. But yeah, so I'm taking what I'm doing here. I'll leave a camera. Say last year I had roughly a dozen cameras sprinkled across 3 or 4 counties in Iowa, and 10,000 acres of public land up in Wisconsin. And not each, I had less cameras up in Wisconsin, but and pull the cards, and literally. Me being a nerd, over the years, I used to, in a spreadsheet format, enter the date, enter the time, enter my estimated age class of the buck. To me, that's very important because different age class of bucks act differently. In Iowa, once they hit 4 years old, I think they really start to act differently. Up in Wisconsin, I see that change more along the 3-year-old, and I think like Michigan, it might be similar. It's where there's more hunting pressure, and there's just less older deer. So they get just to a certain age, a certain level of experience, and now they're not in junior high anymore or high school. Now they're collegiate level. In terms of staying alive. And so I just make a list of the deer, and it was a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old. My estimate, do I get it right every time? Definitely not. But most of the time I think I know about how old a deer is. And then I used to manually enter, like, it was in the morning. It was, the temperature at the time of the move, and I would look it up and I would enter, 55 degrees. And that got old as I started to get more data. So I actually
before you say that's the dumbass way, take note. That's how I'm still doing it. Do you sympathize
I did have
with me?
some help. Yeah, absolutely. And that's up until, so I started doing this hardcore in about 2013, like really like looking at observations and trying to find trends related to weather, time of year, that kind of thing. Here in about 2015, 16, I figured out a way to extract weather data from the NOAA website. It's a government website, and they have locations all across the U.S., and I just about guarantee 98% of hunters are within, 20, 30 miles of a NOAA weather station that logs this data. And you can download it in a spreadsheet format. And now it's, without getting too complex, just using a simple VLOOKUP feature in Excel. I type in the date and time for the sighting, and it tells me temperature, precipitation, current, past, and future precipitation, wind speed, wind direction, sea level pressure. What else? I'm looking at it right now. Sunrise, sunset, moon clock position, moon percent, illuminated, all those fun little details to me anyway. So, it took half an hour here and an hour there over the course of a number of years to build that. But now, literally, all of the time it takes is data entry for entering the time and the date. And, there is some setup, it's based on, location specific. So you have to bring in the data for your, whatever town's closest to you. Usually they're airports or just weather stations in small towns. And now I have this enormous amount of data. Like last year, for example, I have almost 500 data points from 2-year-old and older bucks in Iowa. And I have almost that number of data points from 2-year-old and older bucks up in Wisconsin, over between, say, August and December of last fall. So for the whole fall. And I can look at the trends. I look at not just location specific, but I want to look at just trends overall over the course of the rut, like when did it peak, what influences the peaks, and we can really dive into that. I've learned some interesting things. But
so before we get further, first off, to develop something like this, you go and you download the weather data from the NOAA website for a specific location. And it gives you the whole, I'm assuming you pick a date range, so maybe October 1st through January 1st or whatever it is. It gives you a spreadsheet with all of the data for every single day. You create a tab in your spreadsheet, paste that into the tab on your spreadsheet. And then you have another tab of that spreadsheet, which is where you're putting all of your observations, so the dates and the times of the observation. And then through some fancy spreadsheet magic, you connect those two so that it spits out the data. It connects between your date that you put in there and then what the actual weather is. I do not remember how to use Excel that well, so I couldn't do that myself. But I'm sure there's tutorials online, or maybe there's even a way to get a template out there for people. I don't know, but there's all kinds of tutorials. You can. I'm kind of hesitant to just blast out my spreadsheet to everybody. I've given it to a few people, but there's like you. So say November 1st at noon, you had a buck run past your trail camera. You enter that date, and now instead of having to manually look up, the temperature was 58 degrees, it'll automatically it was 58 degrees, and this was the barometric pressure, and was it raining or not? Those kind of things. So very good
and
stuff.
the weather website is it's www.ncdc.noaa.gov, and then you go to the local climatological data, and it's free. Anybody can do it, and you can search by your location and download the weather. And it's usually recorded in 15-minute or hour intervals for your location. So, it documents what the weather was. And for everyone else's reference, I'm pretty sure Wonderground and all the other websites, I guess Wonderground doesn't even have historical data anymore. I don't think they do. But they all get it from this NOAA website. I think everybody does. I think that's the go-to place to get weather data.
So in your spreadsheets, you have a whole bunch of different metrics or variables tracked. Are these hand-selected because you think that they have some kind of impact, or is this just everything NOAA has and you just allow it all to populate?
Yeah, it's not everything NOAA has. NOAA has tracked so much, it's ridiculous. They have like heating degree days and cooling degree days, which might be interest to you if you're a hunter and doing a lot of food plots. It's a measure of a lot of farmers pay attention to, how warm or cool versus average it is. But then I just started hand-picking things. So it's things that I think are indicators. Now, I've looked into some of them, and some of them don't end up being much of an indicator. But it's really interesting. I mean, I can run it through, I look at day of the week. I look at AM versus PM versus midday, and I just define midday a little arbitrarily as between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. A couple of things I look at that are location specific. I try to, I've just started looking at what direction bucks are headed on camera. So sometimes when I'm hanging a camera right in a bedding area and there's a bunch of beds around, it can be confusing to me, like where they're coming from, where they're going to. And I've started to find trends. So I enter, say, a buck's heading from left to right on camera, and I can remember what direction that camera was pointed. So I'll enter left, right, and it'll say, oh, in the morning, bucks are coming from the left. In the evening, in the afternoon, they're coming from the right. And then that tells me a lot more than, just, so, oh, they're bedding over there, and then they're switching to bedding over here. So, sky conditions, I look at sky conditions. It's another stat from NOAA. Overcast versus clear or versus partly cloudy. And then I really dive into temperature. In my opinion, temperature is the number one external factor, outside like the rut time of year. Like weather factor, it's temperature. Without a doubt. There's nothing else that comes close, actually. So in terms of where a deer is and why he's moving to certain places. So I look at temperature, like departure from average, meaning I look at the average temperature for that time of year, and is it, average, or is it 10 degrees hotter, 10 degrees cooler? I look at 2-hour temperature change, which is kind of an arbitrary number, but is that, the temperature has a big impact on when a buck gets up and moves to another bed during the middle of the day, if it's warming up or cooling off. So I've learned that. Then I look at precipitation, both when it's like at the time of the photo, but I also want to know like what it's going to do and then what it was doing before, for a few hours before and after, because so what I found both in Wisconsin and down here, and I've heard you talk about it, Mark. I've heard others talk about it. And it sounds like, in Michigan, there's the theory that, older bucks prefer to move in the rain. What I've found so far is, at least now in Wisconsin, deer don't move so much in the rain. It's distinct drop. However, they do really like to move right before and right after a rain. And I think a lot of time it's adjusting bedding to new locations, to seek shelter or leaving and maybe going to feed in preparation for the rain or after the rain. So that's what I found. Wind direction I look at, that's a very locational thing. So but I've looked at all my observations all together for an entire fall. It's actually very eye-opening just what average wind directions are. And this data goes back over several years, but basically a third of the time the wind is south or southwest, a third of the time the wind is northwest or north, And then the remaining third of the time, you're left with west, which actually isn't that a straight west wind isn't that common for this part of the country, or some easterly. So it's very split up. You usually get a southerly wind or a northerly wind, and occasionally something else. I look at barometric pressure. Barometric pressure is something that I've really dove into. I thought I was going to find actually more than I ended up finding. So I look at pressure change, but I also look at just like overall pressure. And there's no denying deer really like a high barometer. You get above, for this part of the country, 30.25, 30.3. And there's definitely, deer on their feet more in daylight. And I should have led with this, but, I'm really looking at daylight photos only. I pretty much ignore nighttime photos because, well, it's just, I'm looking at times I can hunt. And deer, do move a lot at night, but I really want to know what's making them get on their feet during the day. So if that helps anybody along, I'm really only looking at daylight photos from, during hunting hours, say half an hour before daylight to half an hour after dark.
Do you track your observations too, like what you see with your own eyes?
Yes. Yep, I do. And that's actually it's good. But it's kind of tricky, and I hesitate to tell anyone to compare it to your trail camera observations because of the size of what you're observing. And because with a trail camera, you're watching, something 50 feet or maybe at most 100 feet in front of that camera, and, a narrow window. Whereas if you're sitting on stand, you could maybe record things in bow range, because that's a fairly small area. But if you're sitting on stand and, in one stand, you might, in dense cover, you might only be able to see 40 yards or 30 yards. And in another stand, if you can see across fields, you might be watching deer 400 yards away. So that doesn't really tell, if they're moving over there, that doesn't really tell you anything about your spot, just what you're looking at has a big impact there.
Right. You almost need to you need to append that observation to where the deer's location was, not to your stand location.
Now, a lot of you guys are familiar with the old hunting tradition of eating, some organ, the heart or a chunk of liver off the first animal you kill. I had that when I was a little kid, and it was a big deal. Organ meats were always prized by frontier people who knew the importance of getting a lot of different minerals and nutrients. And as often is the case, those guys were onto something, because organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. And you can get the same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil, made exclusively from regeneratively raised, grass-fed, and finished cattle. Heart and Soil's unique freeze-drying process means all those important nutrients are trapped in, ensuring you experience every one of the benefits of nature's superfood in a clean, convenient, taste-free capsule. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And make sure to use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. That's heartandsoil.co. Use the code MeatEater. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Yeah, back to pressure. So pressure, deer like a high barometer, but it's not as big of a trend as I thought it might be. I compare it to like average barometric pressure for the year, which I know Mark Drury way back in a couple of his podcasts had talked about that, given into that, and it's true. Average barometric pressure might be around 30 inches of mercury in early season, and that goes up to say 30.1 or maybe a little more by November. And, so departure from average is important. It's not just, 30.3 inches of mercury is screaming high in September, October, but it's high, but it's not as high come mid-November. As the atmosphere cools, pressure on average gets a little higher. And then, of course, I dive into the moon, which is everyone's favorite theory. So I look at two different things. I look at both, phase of the moon. So, new moon, full moon. And then also what I call, I probably spent way too much time that this by itself, I probably have spent more time on than any other thing because everybody else has too, right?
Yes.
Moon clock position. So I call it moon clock position, but red moon, whatever you want to call it. If a moon's overhead or underfoot, to me, if it's directly overhead, in my mind, that's 12 o'clock. Directly underfoot, that's 6 o'clock. If it's rising, it's 9 o'clock. If it's setting, it's 3 o'clock. So that's how I break it down.
Okay.
Yeah. So
it's a good way.
It's just, it's and it's not the right way. It's just the way I do it, and I can visualize in my head. Anyway, what have I found? I have found absolutely no correlation with moon clock position and deer movement. So, and that's out of, and I will say, I used to be one that I did think there was a slight correlation. That was my qualitative observations from sitting on stand. Man, I thought I saw a lot of deer when, the moon was overhead and underfoot or rising and setting. But if it's there, it's such a slight trend, and it's so overshadowed by weather information, or weather, whatever the weather is at the moment. I've about written it off. Moon phase, I've looked at that. Like, do they prefer a full moon or new moon? And once again, I have not found hardly anything. I've found only one thing that seems to be associated with like moon phase. And that is, for whatever reasons, so I don't just track each observation, but then I plot them on a big graph over the course of the fall, so October, November, December, and to see when peak activity is. I'm getting a whole bunch of deer early November. Obviously, that's peak movement. That's the rut. That shouldn't surprise anybody. But cold fronts, there's usually a spike in activity. There's no, cold fronts always, as everybody knows, has a big impact on deer. And the bigger the cold front, the better. And I'll dive into that later. I'll finish talking about the moon. The moon, around that full moon, the rutting moon, quote unquote, I am seeing a spike in activity. It's not huge, but it seems to every single time there's a full moon, anywhere from mid to late October to mid-November, whenever that full moon falls, I'm seeing in a 3 to 5 day window around that full moon, mature bucks seem to be a little more on their feet more during daylight. Why? I have absolutely no idea. I know there's been telemetry studies that have not found anything. However, I will say, I think those telemetry studies are pretty limited because of how they measure data. A lot of them I've noticed measure like miles per day. Well, that's not nearly precise enough. You need to dial into either like during daylight, and for weather events, you need to dial into 1 hour or 2 hour increments to have any clarity on like what a weather event has on an animal. A 24 hour, put it this way, I'm not surprised they're not finding any correlation, because if you're measuring distance over a 24-hour period, deer are getting up, they're going to eat, they're coming back, and they're doing that every single day, whatever the weather is. But exactly when they're doing it, well, that is impacted by, environmental factors.
Yeah,
so
that little change is what really matters to us hunters. So if a buck moved half an hour early, that might not show up on their big studies, but that sure as heck makes a huge difference for us as a hunter. That's exactly what I've always thought.
I'm hoping these telemetry studies get better, and I know a lot of them are limited, I believe, by battery life in those collars. They can't be, strapping 9-volt batteries onto those deer.
Right.
So, the more data points, the more pings, if they're doing it every 15 minutes or every hour or 3 times a day, that has a big impact on how often they do it. So I understand it's not anybody's fault, but I'm hoping these researchers start to measure in much more frequent intervals, and the sky's the limit on what we'll learn about deer.
So with all this stuff that you're looking at, you listed 15 different variables or more that you're looking at. You kind of mentioned a few that seem to have a big impact. Some others don't. When you're actually heading out to hunt, or you're sitting at home before your weekend hunts or whatever, and you're thinking through what your game plan is going to be, which one of these actually factor into your decisions? Like, is there a top 5 list or anything like that are the real heavy hitters that you really focus your time and energy around?
Yeah. So number one's temperature. I've really learned that, deer favor cool areas when it's warm out and warm areas when it's cold out. Security's top priority. So, they're only in certain areas that they feel safe. But within those, I have a theory. I'm not sure that deer move less when it's hot out. I think they just move in different spots, and most hunters aren't watching those spots. So that's part of the reason why everybody, it's a cold front, deer moving like crazy. I actually think nobody bothers to watch the warm weather spots. And a couple of reasons there. One, they're not necessarily where deer spend a lot of the time in the fall. In the fall, it's usually cooler. The cold days outnumber the warm days on average. And also the cool spots are usually heavier cover, lower down by water. And people, you can't see a cold front deer out in a field feeding, and you can see them from half a mile away. When it's hot weather, they're seeking shade. They're seeking, cool north slopes in hill country, which is a lot of what I hunt. And you can't see very far in a lot of these areas. So people think, they're not moving. Well, I've got deer up and walking around, and it's 85 degrees, with 90% humidity. I'm getting them on camera. They're probably not running around and rutting heavily, but, they do move, but it's usually so that really has improved my if I'm hunting and it's less than optimal weather, warm weather, whatever. And I used to think, I still don't like sitting on stand and sweating. I'll still call it less than optimal. I just don't like doing it, but, I will do it. And I've killed a couple of bucks now here in warmer than average temperatures in spots. You're looking, shade, cool north slopes, water, often combinations of all those. And I'm getting into the deer. That's where they are, and they're getting up and they're moving in daylight. They're not maybe moving very far, and they're not walking out into fields if it's bright sunshine, especially, if they've grown their winter coat. 80 degrees in September is a lot different than 80 degrees in November after a deer has grown its winter coat. So it has a huge impact by time of year too. So temperature, if it's really cold out, I like the extremes because that really concentrates the deer. I can't say I like hunting in super hot weather, but if it's super hot, the deer really stack up. In some of these spots, if it's super cold out, they're flipping, they're getting out of the wind. So they're getting on the leeward slopes. They're getting down further on the leeward slopes. So they're completely out of the wind. Instead of up close to the top, they might get a little down lower, but they'll seek sunshine. They will, they'll if it gets really cold, then they'll get up and move a lot more frequently because they have to. And of course, as it gets colder, they need more calories. So they are putting the feed bag on more. There's no denying that. So the temperature is definitely number one.
Now, are you saying temperature? Yeah. Sorry, but to clarify, are you saying absolute temperature or temperature change, or are you lumping that all together?
Yeah. So, So all the above. So both temperature in relation to average temperature for that time of year. So say it's October 1st and it is 60 degrees out, and your average temperature is, say, 70 degrees, deer are going to, be moving somewhat more. They'll probably be hitting the food a little more, but they'll be really seeking the kind of the warmer areas. They're not going to be in the areas necessarily that they would be if it was, say 80 degrees. And just like in November, say, and this is kind of one of my, the light bulb came on a couple of years ago. And this was a northern Wisconsin hunt. So it's not an Iowa hunt. It's a big woods hunt. I was up there early November for a rut hunt, and we were hunting around the edge of the swamp. And I could hear deer chasing out in the swamp, and I didn't see a deer the whole day that first day. And the second day I was like, well, I'm going to go, and I was right up to the edge of the swamp. I really thought I was in it. Lots of sign there, nothing, but I could hear crashing out in the swamp. And the next day I got up, and I started to just snake out into this island. And long story short, I didn't kill a buck, but I had a ton of action. And as soon as I started walking in the swamp, it was one of those days, the temperature was nudging 80 degrees in early November. And as soon as I went out of the swamp, it just felt a lot cooler. And the rut was going full bore out in that swamp. And there was nothing out outside of that because it was hotter. And it wasn't that I was outside the security. I was in the thick stuff, but I wasn't down into that water. And those deer were running from island to island out in the swamp, because it was warmer. And correspondingly, actually, I've hunted that same area. The year after that, it was actually snowing. So it was colder than average. It was spitting snow, miserable weather. I went out and sat the same spot that I'd sat a year before that, except it was, instead of 78 degrees, it was 38 degrees. And I didn't see a deer out in that swamp all day long. I sat there all day long. And then I'd had a camera there, and I looked, and they were out there. That was a hot weather spot. They were out, running around in islands and from island to island chasing does when it was really hot out. But as the temperature plunged, there was significantly less movement out there. And then I think they were out around the perimeter of the swamp, more on drier areas, because it was cold and they didn't want to walk around in the water. So just little stuff like that. So it's both departure from average temperature and then also change of temperature. And that's really location specific. Like, is it heating up or is it cooling down? And are they seeking warmth or are they seeking, cool? So, beyond
next?
That, for location specific, it's definitely wind direction. Deer use the wind. There's no doubt about it. Now, they aren't always just walking into the wind or walking with the wind to their back. Although I have seen, like up north, it seems like deer favor walking with the wind to their back more often, but it's not a strong trend. But it's every location, and I think it's because of wind-based bedding. I'll see a lot more deer with certain wind directions. So that's one of my favorite ways to filter spots. It's an easy way. It's like, this spot, 2/3 of the movement was on southerly winds. So you're hunting with a southerly wind. You have to, even if it doesn't seem to work right for you as a hunter, you have to figure out a way to hunt it effectively with that kind of wind.
Yeah.
Because if it's a southerly wind spot and you're hunting with the north wind, you are wasting your time. So
that's been a big one for me.
Yep. So, and I used to too. I think back of a lot of hunts that I'd had, and I would hunt before I even really understood like the windward versus leeward slope. Deer definitely most of the time favor leeward slopes. Never say always or never, but I would hunt these windward slopes.
Just in case someone doesn't know, can you explain what that means?
Yes, absolutely. So a windward slope, a ridge, imagine a ridge and the wind's blowing across it. So it's blowing from one side to the other. So the side of that ridge that the wind is hitting is the windward slope, and the side away from the wind. So the wind's kind of blowing over the top of your head. If you're out of the wind on a ridge, that's the leeward slope. So, there's many different theories. I really haven't made up my mind for exactly why. the deer travel on the leeward side. Dan Infalt has a good theory. I think there's something too, about a thermal tunnel. I think there might be other things, going on there too. Not just that. Deer basically can smell the whole ridge upwind of them, and then they also can smell and also see often down the ridge below them. So they have the eyesight and the scent, their nose protecting them. Anyway, so deer favor leeward slopes, and I would hunt windward slopes, and I'd have a rotten luck, and there'd be deer sign everywhere. And why am I not seeing deer there? And then, after a little while, and I learned it from the Hunting Beast, which is a great thing for people. I don't hang out there a whole lot anymore, only because I have no time left in my life, it seems like, to spend on there. But it's a great resource for hunters to learn more about, hunting in competitive environments, public land and stuff. But the wind direction is huge, and that's really, I have spots, for west wind, and I have spots for north winds and southwest winds. That's how I filter my setups based on where the deer are.
Would you agree that if we're looking at patterning deer, not by specific bucks, but if we're patterning areas, locations, my assumption would be that wind direction and time of year are probably the most impactful variables that would tell you when a given spot would be good versus when it's not. Is that right? If I'm looking at locations, are those the two biggest maybe?
And temperature. Like I have really learned, there's cold weather spots and there's hot weather spots. So that's the big three.
So you're saying it's not just that deer will move more in general first, like they'd be moving. I guess my assumption was going to be that you're going to say temperature would just change deer movement everywhere, but then wind direction and time of year would say, okay, well, this little bedding area picks up with those conditions. But you're saying actually there's going to be specific locations that are, when it's cold, deer prefer this spot. I guess kind of like the swamp example.
Yep. And I've got other examples. I've got a really killer bed location picked out on public land here in Iowa, and I have not killed a buck there yet. I'm just waiting for the right buck to be in the area. I've hunted it a couple times, but it's a hot weather bed, and bucks consistently bed there when it's over 70 degrees in October and November. It's you can't find it if it's colder than average. I've had a camera there now watching this area for 3 years in a row, all fall. I drop it out there late summer and I pick it up in the winter. And in the cold weather, there's rarely a deer in that area. Hot weather, it's a strong percentage.
So what about it makes it like that?
Yeah. It's right above a big spring. So there's a big spring coming out of a hillside, and it's about halfway down a north slope. So it's in dense shade, and it's right above water, so they can get a drink, and it's also cooler, like that cool water. Yeah. You go there and you just notice it's 5 to 10 degrees cooler than if you were at the top of the hill. It's harder than heck to hunt because it's, kind of in a hole, but I think I can hunt one side of it with a south wind, which of course they favor with a south wind. Not so much, I think, because the wind kind of swirls. I think it's mostly because south wind is hot, associated with hot weather. So, so that's the big three. It's time of year, temperature, wind direction. So, to me, and everything else, like I used to think, it's pressure, but pressure doesn't dictate where a deer is. It might dictate how much they're interested in food. So they might get up a little earlier if it's a good high pressure system, but it's not a big, it's not quite the driver that I thought it was. And people should keep in mind, pressure and temperature, and wind speed, actually, they all go hand in hand, not to get too complicated. But, when you have screaming hard winds, your barometer is probably moving, because that's, wind is air molecules going from one spot to another. And the reason they're doing that is probably because between a low pressure system and a high pressure system, so that they're correlated, wind speed's another one, not just wind direction, but wind speed. The harder the wind, the lower the deer get in the hills, in my experience, especially with cold winds, but in general, all winds, I see them drop down in elevation. And if it's a really screaming cold wind, they may be down in those valleys temporarily to seek shelter. So I've got a spot or two that if I know I'm a big cold front during the rut with at least 20 mile an hour wind gusts, I'm getting down there and the rut is on down in the valleys, and I could be up on the ridge and freezing my butt off and I wouldn't see a thing. So stuff like that.
So if I'm trying to implement a tracking system, kind of like you have here, and I'm starting to think about patterning locations in this kind of way, what are some key things to make sure I'm doing? Or I mean, there's the basics, like track a bunch of data, put it in here. Is there anything or any mistakes you hear people commonly make when they talk about how they're trying to track deer movement activity, or anything you haven't mentioned to just kind of tie up the tracking part of this?
Yeah, I guess that in my opinion, the most common mistake is trying to just follow around an individual deer. Like if you want, it's okay to try to go after an individual deer, but you need to approach it instead of trying to, just draw a line on a map for where he's going. And I know there's some tools that have been marketed for that. It's really, you need to look at like, where is he frequenting? And then look at those spots and why is he frequenting them? In what conditions is he frequenting them? Instead of looking at it from the, trying to just project out a line on a map for where the deer is going to go. You look at like, well, a majority of the time he's over, on this ridge system, when it's, late October and it's cold weather. And then, when it was warm weather, I would get him over here, more down in this bottom, that's, I find a lot more, value in. So,
if you were trying to target, sorry to interrupt your stream of thought there,
that's all right.
If you were trying to target a specific buck, would you change anything that you're doing here from a tracking system? Would you add any variables? Would you ignore any of them? Anything you'd adjust?
That's where, and I do, I try to keep tabs on individual bucks. I rarely go after one all by itself, but it's usually like, there's a couple of bucks in this area that I want to go after. I think you may want to bring in more data sources. So that's where it comes into, okay, well, maybe you want to move a few more cameras into the area. The challenge with this, I am playing the long game, and I know in the majority of the country, hunters don't, especially on public land, hunters don't have the benefit of being able to follow a deer when he's 3 and 4 and 5 years old. And I mean, most 3-year-old bucks get killed in Iowa too on public land. Okay. That's not, some get through, but most of them will die. So if what I'm doing is playing the long game for next year, I'm really not looking at this year's, all my cameras. I have a few cameras that I have in more easy to access and maybe a couple that I check more frequently. But the vast majority I hang, and I will not check them until the season's over, or at least I'm done hunting and I'm picking stuff up. So if you're looking after an individual buck, if you watch closely those good up and coming 3-year-olds, a lot of times those patterns change a little bit, but they're still somewhat similar. They definitely get more nocturnal and more secretive when they hit 4. But their areas often are the same. Sometimes they do even shift home ranges. But gather as much data as you can. The more options you have after a buck, the better. You don't want to just pin your hopes on just one location. You're probably going to fail. Because especially once again, I'm targeting bedding. I'm going to hunt that spot once. Occasionally I might hunt a spot twice, but it's really rare. That's 90% of my public land kills have been first time sits for that location for that year. And that trend I expect to continue. So, and I used to hunt spots many more times, and I just wouldn't have the success. So now I've just basically almost quit hunting spots more than once, unless it's kind of special circumstances and I really think I got in and out clean. And the cleaner your entry and the exit, by all means. There are some spots you can hunt repeatedly, but it's a very rare spot, I think. Most deer will smell you.
I was going to ask, going back a little bit, pivoting away from individual bucks back to locations. You mentioned you're typically targeting bedding areas, but are there any other types of places you try to pattern? Like, do you also set, fall, 5-month-long trail camera sets over typical funnels or anything like that you want to see what's happening year after year and you can get an annual pattern off anything other than bedding areas?
Yeah. It's usually a shorter window because bucks, it's all about bedding outside of the rut. And even during the rut, it's still all about bedding, but sometimes it's not just about their bedding, it's about the doe bedding. So usually the travel routes that I'm targeting still connect bedding areas, say doe bedding areas and such, but I do put cameras on really good funnels. Not usually the super obvious rut funnels, mostly because in public land, other people are always hunting them. The classic inside corners and stuff, I just don't see fully mature bucks using them regularly on public land. They may occasionally, and you can occasionally kill one, but I have a lot higher odds getting into the more, the harder to see funnels. Like you got a really long ridge system, and on the leeward side, there's this great big ditch, and basically all the deer are bottlenecked into a ditch crossing, a third of the way down from the top, or maybe there's a fence line, and a tree fell across the fence line. And so that's that crossing on the leeward side. So I'm looking for things like that, and I'll put a camera and say, maybe there's bedding up the ridge and bedding down the ridge. So I know deer are coming back and forth through, and I'll monitor that. So it's not always, it's got to do with bedding, but it's sometimes buck's behavior, chasing does, and seeking does after, around the bedding areas. So yeah, I do that as well. And I don't have much luck trying to determine trends for deer coming out in food sources. So, I occasionally do have cameras watching food sources, but I don't usually look at that data that close. Just because deer have to eat. So they come out and eat, and they may be more likely to come out during the day if it's optimal conditions and they're bedding closer by. But I have a lot better luck looking at bedding trends than if they're coming out and eating in a food source. Usually they're going to come out and eat every night. Maybe you can find a trend, or you came out in daylight and it was a big cold front, that kind of thing. But and also you actually end up with kind of too much data when you're looking at food sources, because if they're on camera every single day, okay, they're on camera every single day, what are you going to do about it, kind of thing. Whereas bedding, he was using this bedding area for 4 days out of a 7-day window, and then he wasn't there for 2 weeks, and then he was back. That tells me a lot more.
Okay. So I interrupted you when you were talking through some mistakes people made. Did you finish up what you wanted to cover as far as mistakes with tracking, or do you?
Yeah.
If you did, we can move on.
Hunting by the moon. Hunting by the moon. I'll come out and say it. A lot of people I know on the Beast are probably mad about that, but I don't know. A lot of people have had success doing it, but man, I just after looking at a couple thousand data points, I just have not found any correlation between where the moon is and when they're moving. Not to say maybe it does exist, but the weather is an order of magnitude more important if he's going to get up that, and things like hunting pressure, and that's important. I've talked about all this stuff. Like hunting pressure, if you're looking at big three, that probably comes first, honestly. As a mature buck, once he's reached that age, he will not move if he doesn't feel safe. So, for example, in Iowa, We have an early muzzleloader season, which runs third week of October or something, just as the rut's starting to heat up, or second week October, I guess, usually, something like that. Depends on how the calendar lays out. And I've learned, there's certain areas that muzzleloader hunters will frequent, and I won't get anything on my cameras in that time period and for a little while afterwards, and then deer will start showing back up. And others that actually I see pressure bedding, even here in Iowa, where I know we don't have quite the pressure that, say, you deal with in Michigan, certainly not on public land there. But I see pressure bedding, meaning when there's a bunch of people in the woods, certain areas deer really frequent because humans just do not get in there. It's just too nasty, or you have to cross water or something like that. They really, and when humans aren't in the woods, you may not see as many deer or mature buck sightings in those areas. So it's been eye-opening to me. I have a couple of spots that I like to hunt during that early muzzleloader season because no other human other than me gets anywhere near there. And I have, or maybe they do get somewhat near there, but they still can't see it. They're not hunting it. And deer know they can move just that extra 200 yards or 100 yards and be completely secure after the humans stink up the woods for a few days. So,
an interesting thing as I'm hearing you talk about all this is I follow a lot of this data similarly. I pay attention to a lot of these things, and I really think there's something to it. But we're kind of using it in slightly different ways. It seems like. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm curious to hear if you think about it in the same way I do sometimes. So it sounds like most of the time you're looking at this data to help you know where to hunt, like when to hunt which spot. And you're finding that a certain wind direction or a certain temperature will lead to the deer movement, or the deer being bedded in a certain location, coming to a certain location. I've always thought more so of looking at this kind of data to tell me when the chances of the very best, or when's the very best chance that a mature buck will get up and move during daylight. And then when I get those special days, then I target like my sweet spots, like the spots where I think are like the highest odds for other reasons though. So I'm probably missing the boat a little bit maybe, but maybe is what I do in your box of tricks too? Is that how you're thinking about it as well?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
There are those optimal days, but I've kind of learned we definitely are looking at it a little differently, because I see optimal days for optimal spots, and maybe you're just stopping at the optimal days period, and then you're going to go try to find a spot. So everything ties back to like location for me. So that I guess I try to complete that loop. And I maybe my thinking has, just kind of evolved a little bit from that, because I did used to be like, oh man, there's a cold front hitting next week, get in the woods, this is the time to hunt my best stand. Quote unquote best. Well, now I'm like, what is my best stand? I have a best stand every single day that I want to hunt. I have a best stand.
I like that.
So, so that's and I think that really did help me start to think like that.
And I guess it does depend on how many options you have, right? So someone who has 10,000 acres of public land can probably have a whole bunch of different options. If instead, for whatever reason, you just hunt 15 acres you own or something, all of a sudden you're limited.
Yeah. And that, like, just to be like clear, there's a lot of blanket statements made, and I have a certain strategy, and it's not for everybody. And I do, like, Iowa doesn't have much public land, period. That's part of the reason I love to go up into Wisconsin, because then I can literally walk all day and still be on public land. In Iowa, that ain't happening. 1,000-acre parcel is humongous. Most of the time it's 200-acre parcel. So you're really limited. And even I know, Michigan's even more parcialized from listening to you. A 60-acre parcel is a big parcel there.
Southern part of the state for sure.
And then you go out east and you have a 10-acre parcel. That's a big parcel, So it's crazy how different that requires your strategy to be different. Maybe you don't have 1,000 acres or 10,000 acres. Maybe you have one, 20 acre parcel. I encourage you to get more options. More is better, but, you may be limited, you may be limited to where you can hunt. You can just go out and hunt. You have to find a different strategy to fit that. This, like I've kind of developed this to fit my strategy of, I have 10 times as many spots as I can hunt as I have time to hunt any fall. So, how do I figure out what are the best? I've scouted my butt off for years to find a bunch of really good spots, and I don't have time to hunt them. So, okay, well, I have to filter out and try to figure out what, and I know I'm wired a little bit different because, I'm just fanatical about efficiency, like a good spot is not good enough for me. I want the best spot. I want to find the best spot because, it's going to be better than the good spot. So, I'm always thinking like that. Over the course of, 20 years of hunting, public land, I've started to, I've just changed my thinking.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of you guys are familiar with the old hunting tradition of eating, some organ, the heart or a chunk of liver off the first animal you kill. I had that when I was a little kid, and it was a big deal. Organ meats were always prized by frontier people who knew the importance of getting a lot of different minerals and nutrients. And as often is the case, those guys were onto something, because organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. And you can get the same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil, made exclusively from regeneratively raised, grass-fed, and finished cattle. Heart and Soil's unique freeze-drying process means all those important nutrients are trapped in, ensuring you experience every one of the benefits of nature's superfood in a clean, convenient, taste-free capsule. Find out more at heartandsoil.co, and make sure to use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. That's heartandsoil.co. Use the code MeatEater. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Now, what I'm curious about is if you could now tie a big, nice bow on this for me by walking me through an example or two about how you take something from your data set that you've tracked over a year or two or however many years and then implemented that into a hunt, and how you picked the optimal spot for the optimal time and what that all looks like. I'd love to better understand your whole thought process as you go through that and then execute the hunt.
Yeah. So let's see. It's ingrained. It's been ingrained into most of my. Well, first of all, I haven't hunted a whole lot the last 2 years. I've killed a couple of bucks, but I've been I'm working full time and going back to school and 2 little kids. And last year I hunted 7 times total, and it wore me out. It was pretty pathetic. But the good news is my school's getting done. I'll be done with that, and I'll be able to hit the woods a little harder here this fall. So I'm happy to announce that. But anyway, like even last year, I killed a buck, and it was, I think it was the October 22nd. It was right on that full moon. So I was expecting more pre-rut activity because of the full moon. There's a spot that it's a travel corridor, and it's used at a high frequency for southerly south and southeast winds for bedding. So it's kind of a warmer weather bedding. And it happened to be, at that day, I think it was, south or southeast wind. I knew that from trail camera sitting there from the fall previous. And so bucks preferred to bed there when it was a little warmer than average. They usually bedded there when, the pre-rut was heating up. So in the October 20th to 30th, the pre-rut usually is heating up, but it's not linear. As everybody knows who's hunted that time period, it's really on, off, hot, cold. You're either seeing nothing or you're seeing some really good action. There doesn't seem to be much in the middle. I love the pre-rut. That's my favorite time to hunt, the last half of October, really. And I knew that buck was in the area. I still remember he came in, and I wish I'd have gotten on camera. And I in general, I don't have any interest in recording and videoing my hunts, but I shot him and he ran and he tipped over right in front of the rising full moon, so it was coming up over the horizon. Wow. Just a few minutes before, the closing time. And, so that's one example. I've, a few years, let's see, a few years before that, that's a good example, because it was a good, a number of years ago. I used to think that deer didn't like to move in the, when the moon was full. And I also didn't like to think, or I didn't think that deer really, moved as much when it was warm out, until I figured out, hey, they're really moving differently. Maybe they're moving slightly less, but they're moving differently, and you can get on deer when it's warm out. So, it was definitely eye-opening. It's like, hey, I can have success. It was, 70 degrees as a daytime high in late October, which is a little warmer than average for this part of the country. And, there was a big 4-year-old, 22-inch wide 9-pointer, up, and he was up well before dark, and then came wandering in. So, it's really ingrained into just about every single, one of my hunts has that background. Let's see, I can't remember what I killed the year before. I shot something, but it was another story like that. They all kind of blend together.
I understand. That's a good problem to have.
That example that I shared of a couple of years ago up in Wisconsin, where, all of a sudden the rut was on full bore. It was hot out, and it was on full bore in the islands out in the swamp, whereas there was no activity out around the perimeter of the swamp, and it wasn't that there was hunting pressure right there. It was just, they were out where it was cold, cool. And that's been really eye-opening. So 2-3 years ago, I shot 2 years ago, that's another really good example. This was a late season hunt, and it was a muzzleloader hunt. It wasn't a bow hunt, but we had a real cold snap, and the temperature was about -5 degrees or something like that, daytime high. And I knew deer, I knew there was a couple of bedding areas that were more open. They were facing the south. The buck still felt secure. They bedded in them. And I actually, saw him from a distance and, shot him there. I was on the far side of the valley watching the sunlit side of the valley, and there was no activity on my side of the valley, and it was cold. I was freezing. On the shaded side of the valley, kind of sun was kind of behind me, shining on that southerly facing slope. And, there he was, picked him off. And it was, I wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for the brutal cold weather we were having. And there was a stiff wind. So there was a pretty screaming wind chill too. So, it's really, it's all conditional like that.
So I feel like this is my big takeaway for me personally is, it's good to be smart with the timing of your hunts, and you don't want to overhunt things, and you want to be targeted, of course. That doesn't mean, though, that you shouldn't hunt a lot. If you have a lot of locations to hunt, you can find ways to pattern specific locations to know the right spots to hunt, regardless of whether you have the stereotypical dynamite weather, big cold front and high pressure, or maybe you've got hot weather and it's windy. But if you happen to have been tracking all these different locations, you'll start to see these patterns light up. Well, with certain, maybe on the hot days, they're over here. On the cool, great cold front days, they're over here. And all of a sudden, you maybe all of a sudden double your opportunities because you're not just paying attention to those spots that are great for cold fronts that we all key in on.
Yeah. It's not I'm not saying don't hunt. Like that's another, like, oh, if you're not in the woods, you don't kill it. Oh, it's all right. But that's right. But I always add to that, if you're not in the woods, you can't kill one. But if you hunt the wrong spot at the right spot at the wrong time, you're not going to kill one either.
Yeah.
So, like go hunt observation sets. That just gives you more data. You learn so much more. Now I don't have that much time, so I don't hunt observation sets, but that's not because I don't think it's effective. It's just, I don't have much time. I strongly encourage people to go sit in a tree where they can see a long ways and, just watch what deer are doing. That gives you more information on stuff we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
But the important thing is when you figure out preferred conditions for a spot, stay the heck out of that spot until you have those conditions.
Yeah.
Hunt somewhere else. So
one other follow-up on this idea of if I'm going to start tracking locations, that means we're setting cameras for, much longer maybe than the average person is putting them out there. So if I'm running a camera and I put it out there in August, I'm not going to go pick it up till late January maybe. That's a lot of time to put a camera out there for. Is there anything you've done differently for those cameras, whether it be how you set them up or the batteries you use or anything, any little setup tips that we should be thinking about if we're going to start putting a bunch out for this purpose?
Yeah. So with cold weather operate, if you're going to leave it there until the cold weather, you kind of have to use lithium batteries. I've learned that the hard way. The standard batteries just, they croak pretty fast in cold weather. Lithium batteries are temperature. They aren't affected by temperature. You also need a good camera. And that, there's pros and cons. You're leaving it there a long time, so you're worried about somebody walking off with it. But, I like, the Bushnell Trophy Cam is my workhorse. I just have had really good results with that. Browning are fairly good. There's a few other brands that I think are pretty much garbage that I won't mention. Anyway, you leave it. I like to put them up high. I've lost, like 2 years ago, I think I had my very first camera stolen on public land. So it's going to happen, but it's actually very rare. I put them up high. I put a climbing stick and get them up there 10 foot off the ground, angled down. You actually cover more area. I've learned if you angle it just the right amount and get it up that high instead of hanging it, 3.5 feet off the ground like some people do. And your detection area can get a little bigger. And man, it's very, I've lost a couple of cameras now and that's it, to theft. I've had a few malfunction. And this is completely my fault. I forgot to turn on, and my buddy, who is probably going to listen to this, I forgot to turn it on, and I, get up and walk off, and then 3 months later I walk up, and it's still on setup mode, and you want to hurt yourself when you do that. Let me tell you,
that's devastating.
So guilty as charged. Most of us probably have done that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do know that. I have too. It's a brutal feeling.
Yeah. So use a camera that you have faith in, and work your way up. Like I would just be gnawed with worry if I'd gone straight from checking a camera every 2 weeks, which I used to do, 8-10 years ago, to, I would check it more frequently even than that before that, to 4 months, but then I started leaving them a month, then I started leaving them a month and a half, 2 months. And now, and I have very few failures, like last year, I think I had one camera that failed, partway through, out of a dozen plus. So, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen very often. You just kind of have to figure out what works for you. I will say in the summer, it's much tougher to figure out optimal camera placement. So even though I do get some cameras out, this time of year, it's only in spots that I'm really, really confident I know exactly where to put it. I really prefer to wait until like late August into September, because the vegetation's dying down. It's so much easier to get them placed, because otherwise, you get it up and then you're going to have 10,000 pictures of a leaf blowing back and forth in front of your camera,
I know that feeling.
So I used to run more cameras in the summer than I do now, actually. I get a few out, but they're only in spots where like either there's just not much vegetation or, I just know this is exactly how I need to put it. Because I've gotten burned a lot on the summertime cameras, and it's harder on your cameras. Ants and, spiders building cobwebs over your, sensor and stuff like that, or your lens or something like that. I've seen it all. So, I've minimized how much I hang in the summer. Oh, one other thing. So, talk about like optimal weather. I will say, I've looked at weather so much here. As everybody knows, like cold fronts are good, but it's not just that. Optimal weather, the worst weather you can have for a fall is like dead average the whole fall. I've learned I really want swings. Like I want warmer than average, and then I want colder than average. And I want those to last a little while. If those only last a day or two each, it seems like the deer get not confused, but they don't have time to establish any kind of a pattern. And it just seems tougher hunting. So ideally, there'd be like one great big weather system every week, in my mind. Like if I could plan out the perfect weather for a fall, and it would get warm, significantly warmer than average, and then you'd have a 25-degree temperature drop, and then it would get warmer than average, and then you'd have a 25-degree temperature drop every 5 to 7 days. So I thought I'd throw that out there. Like that's perfect. You can have too turbulent weather if it's all back and forth, and the winds from the south one day and the north the next day, and south and north seesawing. That isn't optimal, and nor is like south winds for 2 weeks straight. It's definitely it seems deer kind of settle into a routine after when you get at least 2-3 days of consistent weather, whether it's warm or cold, and then you can get a break in a weather system, and you can restart those trends. So I thought that's something I've observed.
That's a great point. Those swings are pretty key. So, Joe, I know you need to run. We've taken a bunch of your time here, and I want to be respectful of that. So maybe we can get you on again, because there's always more and more I wish we could talk about with you. But it's always a pleasure. And thank you.
No problem.
Thank you for doing this, Joe.
Yep. No problem. So thanks, Mark.
Best of luck this season. Let's stay in touch. And I'm very curious to see how I might be able to start doing a little bit more of this, because I think you're really onto something here about kind of expanding the types of places that we're tracking, and not just deer, not just the best weather, but also how alternate weather patterns can lead deer to certain spots that maybe we're not paying attention to. So intriguing and good stuff. And that is it. I hope all of you fellow deer geeks out there enjoyed this one as much as I did. After talking to Joe, I actually went and started compiling a new data set for the number one buck I'm after here in Michigan, this deer I've been calling Tran. Just logged all of his daytime activity. I've got 15 different days worth of daylight activity that I'm now going to be cross-referencing to all this different kind of data that we talked about. So needless to say, I'm excited, and just can't wait for the season to get here. So thanks for listening, and you can check out more by heading over to themeateater.com, which is where all the new podcasts are going. It's where my new articles are going, where future new videos are going, as well as all the rest of the Meat Eater Network's great podcasts and contributors. You can see articles from the baritone himself, Spencer Newharth. You can check out our podcast with Steve Ranella and Ryan Callahan and Ben O'Brien and April Vokey. All sorts of good stuff out there. And I think you'll find a little bit of something no matter what kind of person you are. So with all that said, thank you for listening. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. You ever get that feeling the walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating you? You crave some wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe in a spot all your own. Well, head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, streams, you name it. Search by acreage. You can search by location. You can search by the kind of hunting and fishing you're dreaming of. Land.com. It is where the adventure begins.